Before we start, I will ask everyone to be muted. And I'm asking the class representatives to note those who will be disrupting the class so that action is taken. We don't want a class that is disruptive. We don't have so much time to waste. And so Teddy and Suleiman and the rest, you note those who will be disrupting the class and note their names down or registration numbers.
Noted.
Well, today we are talking about education in very old civilizations, education in ancient civilizations. And you cannot talk about ancient civilization if you don't put together countries or states like Greece, like Rome, China, like India, Egypt. These are very old civilizations. And most of what we do in education today has been borrowed from those civilizations. Everything we do today comes from somewhere. We are emulating those who came before us. We are emulating those civilizations that had something unique about their education systems. And so we even put some of these countries together based on what we consider as their similarities in the way they organize their education. That's why we say Greco-Roman to mean Greece and Rome. And why Greece and Rome? You know, the influence on each other's education system was profound, albeit with a few differentiations. But by and large, Greece and Rome had similar education systems based on the same philosophies. Now, Greeks, when you talk about the ancient Greece, it is not the country Greece like we know it today, but of course it's in the same area. Then, when it was becoming a civilization, we had more than 20 city-states, which were semi-autonomous. Like each state would run its affairs pretty much independently. The way we have the United States of America, and they have many states, I think 50. Each state is semi-autonomous, even when the federal government runs the affairs of the whole country. Each state can make the bylaws that are binding. And the same was for Greece. There are 20 city-states, each city-state autonomous. The trouble was, most of the time, these states were at war with each other. And because they were at war with each other, education in Greece was tailored to create very strong citizens who could defend their countries at war. I should have told you that today I'm going to summarize because the notes are on the LMS. So I'm going just to guide you on important things. Now, when we're talking about Greece and their education, we focus on two main states, and that is Sparta and Athens. Many of the states had something unique, but there's a stark difference between how education was conducted in Sparta and how it was conducted in Athens. Now, even when we know that education in those two states was organized differently, there were common denominators in those two states that you went to school to, one, fulfill religious obligations. They did not believe in the God we know today. They were actually polytheistic. They believed in many gods. But education served the purpose of having citizens who can fulfill their religious obligation. Now, two, education also helped individuals to engage in politics and to engage in decision making. That decisions that affect your life, you needed to be hands-on, you needed to be participatory. You can't just sit on the side and let decisions be made on your behalf. And you will see that for the two states to be able even to run for office, you needed to have attained the age of 18 and above. You see, even today, we think the age of political participation should be around the age of 18. Now, but importantly, education was also meant to make individuals defend their states in times of war. And like I've said, these states were almost always quarreling with each other. They were almost always at war. And so you needed to go through military training to defend your state if need arose. Now, this is not something that just went away with this old civilization. There are very many countries that insist on military training while schooling. And Kenya tried. There's a number of people you actually know who had to go through NYS paramilitary training after Form 6 before they go to university. It was mandatory. Israel still does that before you go to college, you must go through military training. And why? Look at Israel where it is. It is surrounded by enemy states. Everybody in Israel has some military skills to defend their countries in times of war. Now, generally, the education was also meant to educate perfect citizens. Who are perfect citizens? Those who can do that, those who can fulfill religious obligation, those who can engage in political decisions, those who can defend the states during war. Now, you realize that this education was organized in terms of classes. Greece, like many old civilization, was organized in classes. Like you had the upper class, the middle class, the lower class. You had the military. And so you got education that helped you function well in your specific class. Even the military, they were given very basic education. Actually, they were not even taught how to read and write. It was not necessary for them. For them, they were taught military technology. They were taught how to fight, military warfare. They were taught military science. They didn't have to learn reading and writing because it was not useful for them. Remember, like I've said, organizing the state into classes essentially meant that you only got education that helped you fit in your specific class. And so the children of the rich got a different education from the children of the poor. Now, what is unique about education in ancient Greece? One, military training was mandatory for boys. At around the age of 7, the boys would go to the barracks and learn military drills. You knew how to march. You knew how to, you know how to fight. Being prepared for adulthood, being prepared to defend your country at war. Now, these boys were put through very rigorous training, and this rigorous training was meant to instill in them endurance and to create strong character out of them. Now, reading and writing was discouraged for the soldiers because, like I've said, it was not very important. But military training was also mandatory for boys from around the age of 7. You didn't have a choice. You had to go through military training. Now, these boys were put through very disciplined, very military-like kind of education. And the goal of education was to create people who are both peaceful and strong. You see, you find this to be a bit contradictory, like you're being given a lot of military training, but because of peace, not because of war. So you are being trained to be strong. You are given military training to be strong, but then to maintain peace so that there's no need of fighting. Both of us, in the two states, we are strong people. And so there's no need to fight because we know it won't end well. Now, you realize that in Athens, there was a strong, very strong influence by the philosophers like Plato, like Aristotle, who insisted that education should also be about philosophy. You learned philosophy, not just education for the sake of education. The idea was philosophy then made you to function well, made you to think, to be logical. Now, we want to talk a little bit in greater detail on the Spartan education system because they were different. In Sparta, education was government controlled, that you didn't have a choice but to go to government schooling system. Private schooling was discouraged. Now, the purpose of education in Sparta was to primarily, serve the state. You are going to school to serve the state, not to serve yourself. Now, the education was meant to create capable and accomplished warriors. Sparta focused a lot on military prowess. Now, secondly, this Spartan education system was also meant to create patriots. It instilled in the Spartans the feeling of patriotism, that your country came first. And because your country came first, you went through the military training to help you defend your country if the country was ever at war. But then, this education was also meant to cultivate modesty, endurance, and hardiness. These were considered virtues in the Spartan education system, that you were taught how to be strong. You were taught how to endure. And why? Like we said, the state was, one, surrounded by hostile states, and two, at that time, when you're talking about this ancient civilization around 800 BC, Sparta had more foreigners than citizens. The foreigners were even more than double the number of citizens. You would get worried if your country is, for the most part, full of foreigners. And that's why in countries where there are many foreigners, they don't even give them citizenship. For the simple reason that they know foreigners are many. Countries like United Arab Emirates, it's the same with the ancient Spartan, that there are so many foreigners as opposed to Spartans. The danger was the country could have fallen into the hands of foreigners very quickly, by overthrowing the government or something like that. So to make sure that doesn't happen, you needed to go through very rigorous military training. How does that compare with education in Athens? In Athens, education favored science and humanities. They didn't focus so much on religion. And education promoted science, that is the scientific approaches, teaching that disease is caused by germs and not by the gods. They were taught science. Now, in Athens also, education was meant to promote liberty and democratic ideas. What is liberty? That you are free to do that which makes you happy, makes you pursue your personal happiness. And by doing so, they created democratic ideals, the power of choice, that even with leadership, you are allowed to choose leaders you want. Now, it also helps improve literacy knowledge. And the reality is, the residual outcome of this education in Athens was that it created a lot of intellectuals, including the known philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and so on and so forth. Those literature known as you cannot talk about even literature without talking about Aristotle and Plato. Education was meant to condition the body and mind for physical and mental excellence. It's not so different from education in Sparta, that much as you're given a liberal kind of education, much as the education that you're getting was meant to make you a strong person, it also is meant for mental excellence. Now, education in Athens was supervised by the state. But parents were also free to choose, how their children were educated. It was not like extremely government controlled like it was in Sparta. There was a little bit of liberty in Athens, and parents could choose how their children were educated. But here's the thing. This also created a situation where if parents did not educate their children, when they get old, these children were not obliged that you only supported by your children in old age if you gave them an education. If you did not, then they were not obligated to support you. Now, we had teachers, very knowledgeable teachers who were called sophists. These sophists that they could teach any subject, and they learned the art of disputation. They learned how to argue opposite sides of the court, using logic. According to the sophists, they believe that we do not have universal criteria for truth. We do not have universal criteria or morality. It was context determined by societies where you came from. Now, the laws we can learn from education. And we ask, what is the lasting contribution of the Athenian education? What do we learn from the Athenian education? Or what does the education system in Athens contribute to what we know today? There's a lot of great works of art coming out of Athens. And in the literatures, you've read the Odi, you've read the Iliad, you've read the Republic. These are very old books. Odyssey, very old books, ancient Britain. Now, it's also out of Athens that we get knowledge in political science, ideas like democracy, like the art of government. How do you run the government? There is some echo in the background. I'm not sure what that is. Mark, to help us, there is another, I think, class in the back. Now, there is the temple of Athena. Athena is in Athens. That was built during that time, and it's considered to be an architectural masterpiece that many other civilizations tried to imitate that temple. Even after the wars, the temple still stands. Despite it being in ruins, you can still see that this was a very important piece of architecture. Now, it is in Athens where people moved from attributing everything to the gods to scientific explanations. You were sick not because the gods were unhappy with you, but you were sick because there are germs in your system, because you've been bitten by mosquitoes, because you are not sleeping enough and eating well. And that's why you're sick. It's not because the gods are trying to punish you. So slowly, you see in Athens, people moving from attributing everything to the gods to having scientific explanations to phenomena, that this is happening because it's just science. Now, like I've already said, we had very great poets coming out of Athens, including Sophocles and Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, books that are still referenced even today in literary theory, in literature in general, and in political science. Now, out of Athens also comes a book called History, which is considered to be the mother of all history writings. That the very first time anybody tried to document historical events was in Athens. And we copy that even today, that people now document historical historical events. Now, out of Athens, we also learned that the brain was the center of sensation, that the brain controls everything in your body. We also learned that when we talk about blood circulation, the blood flows from the heart to other parts of the body. We also learned that disease is caused by germs and not spirits. These are ideas that came out of education in Athens. So if you were to ever been asked the lasting contribution of the Athenian education system, you will talk about history, you will talk about art, you will talk about poetry, you'll talk about political science, you'll talk about architecture and reference the temple of Athena, and then you'll talk about medicine. Importantly, that it is the schooling system in Athens that discovered that the brain was the center of circulation, the brain is the center of sensation, that all the senses emanate from the brain, that blood flows from the heart to other parts of the body, that disease is not caused by spirits, but disease is caused by germs. You'll also reference philosophy, that important philosophers like Aristotle, like Plato, like Socrates came out of Athens. And they even influence how we study philosophy today, how we study ethics and morality, that's particularly Aristotle, how we study literature. You know, Aristotle comes up with very good ideas on writing plays, including who should be a hero in a play, who should be a tragic hero in a play. So their ideas still influence how we study those disciplines even today. Now, what is the influence of ancient Greek education in education today? Now, when you look at how they even treated their teachers, you will see there's a lot we copy from there. Now, teachers developed into professionals who were not just trained, but they also specialized. Just the same way we do it today, that all of you are specialized in specific subjects where you're going to be a master and you're going to be teaching that which you have mastered. Now, Plato's philosophical theories also paved the way for government intervention in education. Concepts like education for all are very old concepts. Much as education was primarily focused on boys, even girls later were approved to go through schooling. So this idea we have talked about, I think we mentioned it in the last lecture, about education for all as a concept. If you can remember the Jomtien conference, where there was a declaration for education for all in 1990 in Thailand, it is a very old concept that, came out of Greece education system. When you want everybody to go to school and it is controlled by the state, you are essentially creating education for all. Now, as children grew older and moved through the curriculum, a focus on particular body of knowledge also given to the learners as they made their way from childhood into maturity. Like, at what point would you study the art of public speaking? First of all, you are born and then they inspect if you have any deformities. If you had any deformities at birth in Athens, you will be left at home to stay with your caregivers, with your mother. But in Sparta, Sparta was a bit cruel. If when you were born and they found that you had deformities, they would actually put all babies in the cold weather. Whoever died was just deemed to have been very weak. They didn't want weak people. So you're put in freezing cold weather. If you died, good riddance. If you survive, you are the strong man they're looking for. And so while you are at school, you are given education that relates to your class. Are you a son of a leader, a ruler? Are you going to be a soldier? Or are you going to be specializing in the arts? So you're going to be given education that fitted in your group as a class, concepts that you also see influencing other civilizations like Egypt and China, that you are given education based uh, on your ranking, on your caste, if it's India, on your class, if it's Egypt. Now you will read a little more about those philosophers that I have pointed out, like Plato, like Aristotle, like Sophocles, and see what they brought on the table. It's important to also just know what it is that they preached. If I'm to summarize this in very few words, I will tell you that the education system in Greece was controlled by the government, but the difference was in Sparta, it was strictly controlled by the government. In Athens, it was a bit liberal. Now, in Sparta, it focused a lot on military prowess, teaching endurance, teaching cunningness, teaching strength. But in Athens, it was a bit focused on the sciences and on liberal arts. Now, the outcome of these two was Sparta emerged as a very, very strong country that could defend itself in times of war. Now, the difference is in Athens, there came out very, very important ideas in philosophy. Poetry flourished during that time. And then medicine. We know that most of what we know in medicine, like how the heart works and what causes disease, are ideas that came from Athens. Now, let me try and cover China just as a summary. China is not very different from Greece. And why? That even in China, education focused on traditional values and religious beliefs. Now, I will a little later talk about Confucianism as a concept, but people think Confucianism is a religion. It was not. Now, China, like Greece, was polytheistic, that there were many gods. They did not believe in one God. There were many, many gods, and these gods are deemed to be dealing with different things. You'll hear people say, like, the god of fertility, the god of health, the god of harvest, the god of rain, the god. They believed in many gods, and they believed that their actions were controlled by these gods. Now, Chinese people also believed, in ancient civilizations, believed that how you live your life determines your next life. in a concept called reincarnation. That if you are a good person, in the next life, you will turn into something good. There will be a rebirth. And there's a joke that if you are a very harsh person, in the next life, you might end up being a lion or something like that. Now, the Chinese also believed that ancestors watched over us. They didn't just go. That much as they died, their spirit hovers above us, and they either protect us or harm us. You've had concepts like the living dead. People die, but they even affect those who are alive. Now, in China, there were three major religions. There was Taoism, there was Buddhism, and there was Confucianism. Buddhism mostly borrowed from India because Buddha was Indian, and Buddha is an important figure in Buddhism. But Buddhism was also practiced in China. Now, Confucianism, much as it's considered a religion in many discourses, I want to take it with a pinch of salt, because this is something that was created by this guy called Kung Fu Tse, or Master Kung. Master Kung, also known as Confucius. He founded this philosophy of Confucianism that taught certain ideals to people. And so much as it's considered religion, it wasn't religion per se, but it affected how people viewed life and how people lived their life. Now, Confucius supported and advocated for the education of ethics, that you needed to carry yourself ethically. So besides being taught music, being taught poetry, being taught traditions, being taught history at school, you are also supposed to be taught ethics. He believed that without ethics, a society would collapse. Now, he wanted people to be trained to be mentally disciplined and to be gentle. That you are mentally disciplined and you're gentle to the point that you live well with others. And that should be the whole essence of education, that you're able to live well with others. Now, in China also, we had Taoism. And Taoism simply means path of reason, that how do you reason? What makes you reason logically? Now, it also had a personality behind it. I think all religions have a personality behind it. And for Taoism, it was Lao Tzu. You will see the spellings in the reader. Now, in Taoism, there was emphasis on virtues like humility. That even when you are educated, even when you had wealth, even when you had a position of responsibility in society that, removed you from the crowds, you needed to be humble. That was taught by Taoism. But importantly, Taoism also taught that if you had education, you are supposed to be economically prudent, that don't live an extravagant lives. Spend your money, spend your resources sparingly. You needed to be satisfied with what you have. They taught the principle of contentment, that this is what I have and I am satisfied with it. Now, we are told that Taoism was a laissez-faire religion. Laissez-faire meaning that everything would go. The adherents of this religion were not expected to seek change. They're not expected to interfere with the natural courses of events. They were just expected to live their lives to the fullest. You're not even supposed to think about belonging to private societies. It was not important for them. You just need to live your life as a humble person, economically empowered, prudent in utilization of the resources that you have been gifted by the gods, and just live well with the others. How does that compare to Buddhism? Of course, we already know that Buddhism was borrowed from China, from a personality called Buddha. Buddha created Buddhism. Buddhism also taught about classism, like you got an education based on your class. Are you upper class? Are you middle class? Are you lower class? And when you believed in those classes, you got an education that will help you perform well, help you thrive in that particular class where you belonged. Now, so what was the goal of education in China, in ancient China? One, education in China was primarily made to maintain the status quo. Nothing should change. Actually, change was viewed to be something suspicious. Why do you want to change? Why do you want to move from lower class to upper class? Just to be content with what you have. And therefore, whatever change anybody wanted to make in their life was very slow, it was very gradual. It wasn't people fighting to move from upwards the social ladder, because that was viewed very suspiciously. Now, education in China was also primarily meant to create intellectual curiosity, the ability to be curious about what's going on in the world. Also, it nurtured creativity, it nurtured the spirit of inquiry. And I've also said it also was meant to teach morality. You needed to be morally upright. Now, this whole idea of going to school or getting an education so that you are rich or you become better than others is not something that was taught in the Chinese ancient education system. That you were actually taught to be able to control your personal interest, to be able to be selfless. And so you're doing it for the greater good of the society, not for your own personal gain. But most importantly, this education that you're getting in ancient China was also, for the most part, to just help you be a civil servant so that you can serve the state. You can work in a state office and serve the state. Now, there was no strict national education system. You didn't have not like, at least not like in Sparta. It wasn't very strict. But that doesn't mean it wasn't organized. It was still organized. Elementary level, higher education, and what you'll consider as university. Now, in elementary level, which is like the very basic level of education, boys were admitted at age 7, just like in Greece. You started going to school at the age of 7. You want to ask yourself, do we still take our children to school at age 7? What is the recommended school start age? Now, this elementary education in China, as opposed to Greece, where it was given by the state, in China, it was provided in the homes of teachers and sometimes in temples. So you didn't go to school at elementary level. Instead, you went to a teacher's home to be trained. or you went to the temple. Now, school fees was charged. Yeah, school fees was charged, just like it's done elsewhere. Now, this was intended also to limit or to deny access for children from low-income families. Remember, like we've said already, you got education based on your class. Is your family poor? Is your family rich? So if your family was poor and could not afford, that could lock you out, because then how do you afford to go to school if there's no money? Now, part of what was taught in school was memorization. And then in writing, you were taught how to copy texts. You're given a text in poetry, and you were told to copy on a piece of paper. Besides that, you also were taught philosophy. You were also taught the history of China. Now, like in all systems of education, elementary education was foundational education, education that is preparing you for higher education, just like it is everywhere else. Now, from that elementary education, you are now prepared to go to higher education. Now, this higher education was a bit clustered into several domains. It was either a county or local level education, or provincial level education, or national level education. Now, at the county or local level education, you were taught writing, and then Chinese literature was introduced. Now, this higher education is the equivalent of a degree in modern education. And so at the end of this county or local level education, you earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree. Now, the second stage was the provincial level of education, where you are taught history, you are taught poetry, you are taught the prophetics, taught something about the prophets, and then you are taught etiquette, and then importantly, you are taught piety, which is religious teachings. Now, there were 4 important books that were used at this level, and they taught extensive learning, they taught morality, and then there is this personality we've already talked about called Confucius. Confucius had so many important sayings that were philosophical in nature, that taught people how to live with others. Those sayings were actually taught at this level. Now, at national level, you were introduced to a little more harder stuff. You were introduced to philosophy. You were introduced to ethics. Now, at this point, upon qualification, you got a Doctor of Philosophy degree in what is presently called a PhD, because a PhD essentially means that Doctor of Philosophy. You are a specialist in one specific area, and you are allowed to teach masters. Masters in this context, in this ancient civilization, is just somebody who had gone to school and had written a thesis and had presented this thesis in the public. You see, the more things seem to change, the more they remain the same. Even today, for you to be a master's, you must write a thesis and you must present your thesis in front of a panel. This is a very old way of doing things, albeit with a bit of differentiation, but the idea was you have mastered something to the point that you can teach it to somebody else. Now, to go above that, you learned philosophy, and this philosophy, and you're a doctor of philosophy, which then could enable you to teach those who had mastered the knowledge at a lower level. You ask yourself, what was the lasting contribution of Chinese education system? Now, Chinese education system recognized individual differences among its learners, something that we value today as teachers. That even when you put 14-year-olds in a classroom, they don't have the same intellectual capabilities. And so out of China, we learned that you teach learners based on their individual differences. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach to education. These people are different. They are endowed differently intellectually. And they have different aptitudes. They have different attitudes. They have different strengths. They don't like the same things. And that's why you find in the same class, taught by the same teachers, people don't perform the same way. So it's out of China that we learn to treat students or learners as individuals and not as groups. Now, it's also out of China that we learn that teaching should be directed to develop that which students excel in. So what is he good at? What can he do? This student only wants to sing. So can you give him education that will enable him to sing? Can you give him education that can enable him to act? Can you give him education that can enable him to be a scientist? So interests and ability is also an important concept from China. What does this student excel in? What the student excel in, make the most of it, empower them so that they go and do what they love. So teaching should be directed to develop that which the student excels in. It's also out of China that we adopt what we call the Socratic method. Socratic method was that which was introduced by Socrates in Athens, but copied in China, introduced by Confucian. In China, we call it the Confucian method. Okay? Now, how does it work? You are taught by direction. It's called guided discovery. You discover things by being guided. You're not taught what to think, but how to think. This essentially means that you have such deep learning because you've not been given things to memorize per se. You've been pointed to a direction and you conceptualize these things on your own. The Socratic method, where even the learner is the one that's at the center of this pedagogy. You hear ideals like learner-centered approaches to learning. What does it mean? Learner-centered approaches? What does that even mean? That the learner should be at the center of your teaching. And they teach important things like creating an environment where the learner does not fear the teacher, for the simple reason that you cannot learn well from a teacher you fear. I think I emphasized that in our last lecture. So when you create that friendliness, learners are more than willing to participate. Learners enjoy. And if you participate, if you enjoy it, this knowledge sticks with you for a lifetime. This is what we call learner-centeredness in teaching. And it's an ideal we borrow from China. I intended this lecture to be 1 hour. I know some of you have bought bundles for 20 bob. When we meet next time, we will finish up education in ancient civilization, and hopefully it will be a physical class, but I will communicate. Thank you all for coming, and see you next time. Class dismissed.
See you.
Welcome, sir. Welcome.
The class was good, bana. Manze tumeenjoy bana. Hey, hii class ni nice bana. A very good lecture.
A very good
It
lecturer,
was one of
bana.
the best lectures, manze.
Not bana.
Not bana, not tunatoa. Maneno amecorrect sana bwana.
Kwenda Nyamazini.
Daktari ameshatoka.
Yeah,
Daktari not tunatoa wapi bana? Juu sasa hii maneno yamesokota China. Hii ndio tunapenda sasa.
Kila mtu aende.
Good rising.
Kwani unataka tena lecture kudownload notes?
Kabisa kuna sura ingine
Simnipe enrollment key.
Unataka lecture kudownload notes?
Class imeshika. Nini amesha nini?
Kwenda huko bana wewe.
Hello, please mute yourself. Please mute yourself. I want to share with you something now.
Turn again.
Turn off your microphones.
Turn off your microphone. Please.
Bukosa power.
I want to talk with you something.
Ongea utoka hapo. Koichi one time. Which is stupid.
Brand debate one time.
Babi National School one time. Koichi one time.
Your big boys.